Hi, Ghost Addicts. Welcome to Ghostly Stories. Today we got a really scary ghost story for you. So please take a minute to download the podcast, subscribe, and give us 5-star reviews if you like. And if you want to subscribe to our channel or give us donation, PayPal me anonymous content or buy me coffee Sneakies. If you subscribe to our YouTube channel, we really appreciate it. Storytime fun. All right, we're reading A Thin Ghost in Others. And the reading today is The Residence at Whitminster by Montague, Rhodes, James, or M.R. James. So let's begin. Ooh, yeah. The Residence at Whitminster. All right, this is from the series from The Thin Ghost. It's so exciting. Yeah. Okay, so let's begin. Dr. Ashton, Thomas Ashton, Doctor of Divinity, sat in his study, habited in a dressing gown, and with a silk cap on his shaven head, his wig being for the time taken off and placed on its block on his side table. He was a man of some 55 years, strongly made, of a sanguine complexion, and with angry eyes, and a long upper lip. Face and eyes were lighted up at the moment when I pictured him by the level ray of an afternoon sun that shone in upon him through a tall sashed window giving on the west. The room into which it shone was also tall, lined with bookcases, and there the wall showed between them panels. On the table near the doctor's elbow was a green cloth, and upon it what he would have called a silver standish, a tray with inkstands, quill pens, a calf-bound book or two, some papers, a churchwarden pipe in a brass tobacco box, a flask case in plated straw, and a glass of liquor. The year was 1730, the month December, the hour somewhat past 3 in the afternoon. I have described in these lines pretty much all of that a superficial observer would have noticed when he looked into the room. What met Dr. Ashton's eyes when he looked out of it, sitting in his leather armchair? Little more than the tops of the shrubs and the fruit trees of his garden could be seen from that point, but the red brick wall of it was visible in almost all its length of its western side, and the middle of that was a gate, a double gate of rather elaborate iron scrollwork, which allowed something of view beyond. Through it he could see the ground sloped away almost at once to the bottom, along which a stream must run, and rose steeply from it on the other side up to the field that was a park-like in character and thickly studded with oaks, now of course leafless. They did not stand so thick together, but some glimpse of sky and horizon could be seen between their stems. The sky was now golden, and the horizon, a horizon of distant woods, it seemed, was the color purple. But all that Dr. Ashton could find to say after contemplating this prospect for many minutes was, "Abominable!" A listener would have been aware immediately upon this of the sound of footsteps coming somewhat hurriedly in the direction of the study. By their residence he could have told that they were traversing in a much larger room. Dr. Ashton turned around in his chair as the door opened and looked expectant. The incomer was a lady. A stout lady in the dress of the time, though I have made some attempt at indicating the doctor's costume, I would not enterprise this of his wife's, for it was Mrs. Ashton who now entered. She had an anxious, even a sorely distracted look, as it was very disturbed voice that she almost whispered to Dr. Ashton, putting her head so close to his. "He's in a very sad way, love. Worse, I'm afraid." "Tst, tst. Is it really?" Dr. Ashton says as he leaned back and looked in her face. She nodded. Two solemn bells rang high up, not far away, rang out the half hour at the moment. Mrs. Ashton startled. "Oh, do you think you can give order that the minister clock be stopped chiming tonight? 'Tis just over his chamber, and will keep him from sleeping, and to sleep is the only chance for him, that's certain." "Why, to be sure, if there were need, real need, it could be done, but not upon any light occasion." "This Frank, now, how do you assure me that his recovery stems upon it?" said Dr. Ashton. His voice was loud and rather hard. "I do airly believe it," said his wife. "Then it must be." Bid Molly run across to Simpkin and say, on my authority, that he is to stop the clock chimes at sunset, and yes, she is after that to say to my Lord Saul that I wish to see him presently in this room. Hurry off, my darling. And Mrs. Ashton hurried off. Before any other visitor could enter, it would be well explained the situation. Dr. Ashton was the holder, among other preferments, of a prebend in the rich collegiate church of Whitminster, one of the foundations which, though not a cathedral, survived dissolution and reformation and retained its constitution and endowments for hundreds of years at the time for which I write. The great church, the residence of the dean, and the two prebendaries, the choir, and its appurtenances were all intact and in working order. A dean who flourished soon after 1500 had been a great builder and had erected a spacious quadrangle of red brick adjoining the church for the residence of the officials. Some of these persons were no longer required. Their offices had dwindled down to the mere titles borne by clergy or lawyers in the town and neighborhood, and so to the house that had meant to accommodate 8 or 10 people were now shut among three, the dean and the two prebendaries. Dr. Ashton's included what had been a common parlor and the dining hall of the whole body. It occupied a whole side of the court, and at one end a private door into the minster. The other end, as we've seen, looked out over the country. So much for the house. As for the inmates, Dr. Ashton was a wealthy man and childless. He had adopted, or rather undertaken to bring up, the orphan son of his wife's sister, Frank Sidell, was the lad's name, who had been a good many months in the house. Then one day came a letter from an Irish peer, the Earl of Kildare, who had also known Dr. Ashton at college, putting it to the doctor whether he could consider taking into his family the Viscount Sal, the heir's heir, and acting in some sort as his tutor. Lord Kildare was shortly to take up a post in Lisbon embassy, and the boy was unfit to make the voyage. Not that he is sickly, the Earl wrote, though you will find him whimsical. Or, of late, I have all thought him so, and to confirm this, 'twas only to-day his old nurse came expressly to tell me he was possessed, but let that pass. I warned you couldn't find a spell to make it straight. Your arm was stout enough in old days, and I give you plenty authority to use as you see fit. The truth is here, no boys of his age or quality to consort with, and is given into morphine out in our rafts and graveyards, and he brings home romances that frightens my servant out of her wits. So there you are, and your lady forewarned. It was perhaps with half an open eye to the possibility of an Irish biosprit, at which other sins the Earl's letter seemed to hint, that Dr. Ashton's acceptance the charge of my Lord Viscount Sal and of the 200 guineas a year that were to come to him for taking care of the boy. So he came one night in September. When he got out of the chaise that brought him, he first spoke to the postboy and gave him some money and patted the neck of his horse. Whether he made some movement that scared it or not, that was nearly a nasty accident, for the beast started violently, and the position being unknown was thrown and lost his feet, and he found afterwards, and the chaise lost some paint on the ghost post, and the wheel went over the man's foot who was taking the baggage. When Lord Saul came up to the steps to light in the lamp of the porch to be greeted by Dark Action, he was seen to be thin youth of, say, 16 years old, with straight black hair and pale coloring that is common to such a figure. He took the accident and commotion calmly enough, and expressed a proper anxiety for the people who had been or might have been hurt. His voice was smooth and pleasant, and without any trace curiosity of an Irish brogue. Frank Sidell was a young boy, perhaps of 11 or 12, but Lord Saul did not that reject his company. Frank was able to teach him various games, for he had not known in Ireland, and he was apt at learning them too, and at his books, though he had little or no regular teaching at his home. It was not long before he was making a shift to puzzle out of the inscriptions on the tombs in the minster, and he would often put a question to the doctor about the old books in the library that required some thought to answer. It is to be supposed that he made himself very agreeable to the servants, for within 10 days of his coming they were almost falling over each other in their efforts to oblige the young man. At the same time, Mrs. Ashton was rather put to wit, to find new maidservants, for there were several changes, and some of the families in the towns from which she had been accustomed to draw seemed to have no one available. She was forced to go further afield than was usual. These generalities I gathered from the doctor's notes in his diaries and his letter. They are generalities, and we should like, in the view of that, was to be told something sharper and more detailed. We get in the entries which begin late in the year, and I think were posted up altogether after the final incident. But they cover so many days in all, there was no need to doubt that the writer could remember the course of things so accurately. On a Friday morning, it was that a fox, or perhaps a cat, made away with Mrs. Ashton's most prized black cockerel, a bird without a single white feather on its body. Her husband had told her often enough that it would make a suitable sacrifice to Issachar that had discomforted her much, and she would hardly be consoled. The boy looked everywhere for traces of it. Lord Sal thought brought in a new feathers, which seemed to have been partially burnt on the garden rubbish heap. It was on the same day that Dr. Ashton, looking out of the upper window, saw two boys playing in the corner of the garden at a game he did not understand. Frank was looking earnestly at something at the palm of his hand. Saul stood behind him and seemed to be listening. After a few minutes, he very gently laid his hand on Frank's head, and almost instantly thereupon, Frank suddenly dropped whatever it was he was holding, clasped in his hand to his eyes sank down in the grass. Saul, whose face expressed great anger, hastily picked up the object as though it could be seen that it was glittering, but he put it in his pocket and turned away, leaving Frank huddled up in the grass. Dr. Ashton rapped on the window to attract their attention, and Sal looked up as if in alarm, and then, springing to Frank, pulled him up by the arm and led him away. When they came to dinner, Sal explained that they had been acting a part of the tragedy of Red Medusa, in which the heroine reads the future fate of her father's kingdom by means of a glass ball held in her hand, and is overcome by terrible events she has seen. During this explanation, Frank said nothing, only looked rather bewilderedly at Sal. He must, Mrs. Ashton thought, have contracted a chill from the wet of the grass, for that evening he was certainly feverish and disorder was of the mind as well as the body, for he seemed to have something he wished to say to Mrs. Ashton. Only press of household affairs prevented her from paying attention to the boy, and when she went, according to her habit, to see the light in the boy's chamber when he had been taken away, and to bid them good night, he seemed to be sleeping, though his face was unnaturally flushed to her thinking. Lord Sal, however, was pale and quiet and smiling in his slumber. The next morning it happened that Dr. Ashton was occupied in the church and other business and was unable to take the boys' lessons. He therefore set them task to be written and brought to him. 3 times, if not oftener, Frank knocked at the study door, and each time the doctor changed to be noticed with some visitor and sent the boy off rather roughly, which he later regretted. 2 clergymen were at dinner this day, and both remarked, being fathers of families, that the lad seemed sickening for a fever in which they were too near the truth, and it had been better if he put the bed forthwith. For a couple of hours later in the afternoon, he came running into the house, crying out in a way that was really terrifying, and rushing to Mrs. Ashton, clung about her, begging her to protect him, saying, "Keep them off! Keep them off! Keep them off! Keep them off!" And the boy was crying hysterically, and now it was evident that some sickness had taken strong hold of the boy. He therefore got into bed in another chamber from that on which she commonly lay, and the physician brought to him, who pronounced the disorder to be grave and affecting the lad's brain, and prognosticated the fatal end to be strict quiet, if not observed, and those sedative remedies used which he should prescribe. We are now come by another to the point we have reached before. The minister clock had stopped from striking, and Lord Sal was on the threshold of the study. "What account can you give of this poor lad's state?" was Dr. Ashton's first question. "Why, sir, little more than you already know. I fancy I must blame myself, though, for giving him a fright yesterday when we were acting that foolish play you saw. I fear I made him take it more to heart than I meant." "How so?" said the doctor. "Well, by telling him foolish tales I had picked up in Ireland of what we call the second sight." "Second sight? What kind of sight that might be, and why or our ignorant people pretend that are able to foresee what is to come, sometimes in the glass or sometimes in the air, and maybe in a calduna we had an old woman who pretended to have such power. And I dare say I colored the matter more highly than I should. but I never dreamed Frank would take it so near as he did. You were wrong, my lord, very wrong in meddling with such superstitious matters at all, and you should have considered whose house you were in, and how little becoming such actions are to my character and person to your own. But pray, how came it that you, acting as you say a play, should fall upon anything that could so alarm Frank? This is what I can hardly tell, sir. He passed all in a moment from rant about battles and lovers and Cleodora and Antigones to something I could not follow at all, and then dropped down as you say. Yes, was at a moment when you laid your hand on the top of his head. Lord Sal gave me a quick look at his questioner, quick and spiteful, for the first time seeming unready with an answer. About that time it may have been, he said. I have tried to recollect myself, but I am not sure. There was, at any rate, no significance in what I did then. Ah, said Dr. Ashton. Well, my lord, I should do wrong were I were not to tell you that this fright of my poor nephew may have some very ill consequences to him. The doctor speaks very despondently of his state. Lord Sal pressed his hands together and looked earnestly upon Dr. Ashton. I am willing to believe you had no bad intentions, as surely you could have no reason to bear the poor boy malice. But I cannot wholly freely blame you from the affair. As he spoke, the hurrying steps were heard again, and Mrs. Ashton came quickly into the room carrying a candle, for evening had by this time closed. She greeted, agitated. Oh, come! Oh, come, do come! Come quickly! I'm sure he's going. Going, said Frank. Is it possible? Already? With some such incoherent words, the doctor caught up a book of prayers from the table and ran after his wife. Lord Sal stopped at a moment for where he was. Molly, the maid, saw him bend over and put both hands to his face as if for the last words she were to speak. She said afterwards he was striving to keep back a fifth of laughing. Then he went out softly, following the others. Mrs. Ashton was sadly right into her forecast. I have no inclination to imagine the last scene in detail. What Dr. Ashton records is or may have taken be important to the story. They asked Frank if he'd wanted to see his companion, Lord Sal, once again. The boy was quite collected, it appears, in these moments. No, the boy said. I do not want to see him, but you should tell him that I am afraid he will be very cold. What do you mean, dear boy? Said Mrs. Ashton. Only that, said Frank. But say to him, besides, that I am free of them now. But he should take care. And I'm very sorry about your black cockerel bird, Ashton. But he said what we must use it so if we were to see all that could be seen. But not very minutes afterwards, the poor boy was gone. He was gone. Couldn't believe it. The little boy was gone. Both Ashtons were grieved. She, the wife, most, but the doctor, though not an emotional man, felt the pathos of the early death, and besides it were the growing suspicion that all had not been told by Sal, and there was something here that was out of the beaten track. When he left the chamber of death, it was to walk across the quadrangle of the residence at the sexton's house. A passing bell, the greatest of the minister's bell, must be rung. A grave must be dug in the minister's yard, and there now no need to silence the chiming of the minister's clock. As he came slowly back in the dark, he thought he must see Lord Sal again. The matter of the black cockerel, a trifling as might seem, would have to be cleared up. It might be merely a fancy of a sick boy, but if not, was there not a witch trial he had read in which some grim little rite of sacrifice had played a part? Yes, he must see Sal. I rather guessed these thoughts of his would find written authority for them that there was no another interview, and certainly also that Sal would, or as he said, could, throw no light on Frank's words. Then the message or some part of it appeared to affect him horribly. But there is no record of the talk in the detail. It was only that Sal sat all evening in the study, where he bid good night, which he did reluctantly, asked the doctor's prayers. The month of January was near its end when Lord Kildon and the embassy of Lisbon received a letter for once gravely disturbed that vain man and negligent father. Sal, the boy, was dead. The scene at Frank's burial had been very distressing. The day of the awful, in the blackness and the wind, the bearers and staggers blindly among the flapping black pall found it a hard job when they emerged from the porch of the minister to make their way to the grave. Mrs. Ashton was in her room. Women did not go to their kinfolk's funerals, but Sal was there draped in the morning cloak of the time, and his face was white and fixed as that of one dead, except there was a notice 3 or 4 times he suddenly turned his head to the left and looked over his shoulders. It was then alive with terrible expression of listening fear. No one saw him go away, and no one could find him that evening. All night the gale buffeted the high windows of the church and howled over the upland and roared through the woodland hills. It was useless to search in the open. No voice or shouting or cry or any help could possibly be heard. All that Ashton could do was warn the people about the college and town, the constables, and to sit up and to be alert for any news. And this he did. News came early next morning, brought by the sextons whose business it was open to church for early prayers at 7, and who sent the maid rushing upstairs with wild eyes and flying hair to summon her master. The 2 men dashed across the south door of the minster, there to find Lord Sal clinging desperately to the great ring of the door, his head sunk between his shoulders, his stockings in rags, his shoes gone, his leg torn and bloody. This was what was told to the Lord Kildare, and this really ends the first part of the story. The Tom of Frank Suttle and the Lord of Scotsal, only child to the heir of William Earl of Kildare, is one, a stone altar tomb in the Westminster churchyard. Dr. Ashton lived on for another 30 years in his prebendal house. I do not know how quietly, but without visible disturbance. His successor preferred a house he already owned in town and left that the senior prebendary vacant. Between them, these 2 men saw the 18th century out and the 19th century in. For Mr. Hendiles, the successor of Ashton, became prebendary at 9 and 20 and died at 9 and 80. So it was not until 1823 and 1824 that anyone succeeded to the post who intended to make this house his home. The man who did was Dr. Henry Oldys, whose name was known to some of my readers as that of the author of the rows of volumes labeled Odyssey's works, and occupied a place that must be honored since it was so rarely touched upon the shelves of many substantial library books. Dr. Oldie, his niece, and his servants took some months to transfer furniture and books into his third-story pastures in the quadrangle of the Westminster and to get everything into place, but eventually the work was done, and the house, though which was untented, had always been kept sound and weather tight, woke up, and like Monte Cristo's mansions in the Ataville, lived, sang, and bloomed once more. On a certain morning in June, it looked especially fair as Dr. Oldley strolled in his garden before breakfast and gazed over the red roof of the Minster Tower, with its 4 gold vanes backed by the very blue sky and very white little clouds. Mary, he said, as he seated himself at the breakfast table and laid down something hard and shiny on the cloth, here's a fine, which the boy had just made now. You'll be sharper then if I can guess what it's meant for. It was round and perfectly smooth tablet, as much as an inch thick, of what seemed clear glass. It's rather attractive at all events, said Mary. She was a fair woman with light hair and large eyes, rather devoted to literature. Yes, said her uncle. I thought you'd be very pleased with it. I presume it came from the house. It turned up in the rubbish heap this corner. I'm not sure that I do like it after all, said Mary some minutes later. Why in the world not, my dear? I don't know. I'm sure perhaps it's only fancy. Yes, only fancy and romance, of course. What's that book now? The name of that book, I mean, that you have ever had in your head yesterday? The Talisman, Uncle. Oh, if this should turn out to be a talisman, how enchanting could it be? Yes, the Talisman. Well, you're welcome to it, whatever it is. I must be out about my business. Is all well in the house? Does it suit you? Any complaints in the servants' hall? No, indeed, nothing could be more charming. The only succumb of the complaints, besides the lock of the linen closet, which I told you of, is that Mrs. Maple says she cannot get rid of the sawflies out of that room you pass through the other end of the hall. By the way, are you sure you like your bathroom? It is a long way off from anyone else's, you know. Like it? To be sure I do. The further off from the room to themselves is what I care for. We are not likely to be using it. No, of course not. Well, what you call sawflies are those reddish things like a daddy longlegs, but smaller, and there are a great many of them perching about that room. Certainly, I don't like them, but I don't fancy that they are mischievous. There seems to be several things you don't like this fine morning, said her uncle as she closed the door. Miss Oldies remained in her chair, looking at the tablet which she was going to hold in the palm of her hand. She smiled that had been on her face faded slowly from it and gave place to an expression of curiosity and almost strained attention as she looked at the object. Here was a taste of mingling of modern elegance and hurried antiquity, such as has never here now grace of life either. Ooh, let's end it part one. Ooh, of this ghostly story. So come back for part two. Thanks for listening. Hit the 5-star and subscribe, and thank you for subscribing to your YouTube channel.